I want to welcome everybody to the very first session of the Texas Adult Education and Literacy Instruction Virtual Conference. It's the first time we've done this. I'm Anne Marie Molinari. I will be your host for this session, and I have Dr. Olga Escamilla backing me up, and couldn't do this without her. We also have Beth Ponder, the Director of Professional Development, joining us, and I'm sure there are other colleagues that will be on too. So I just want to say that it takes a village to make this very successful. This is why we are here. This presenter is Catalina Requenes from Region 1 Educational Service Center in Edinburgh, Texas. She is an adult education program supervisor, but I do want to share her incredible background. Catalina works at Region 1 Educational Service Center in Edinburgh, Texas as an adult education program supervisor. For the last 20 years, she has worked as an educator along instructors and students of all ages and grade levels in the areas of K through 12 reading and literacy. She has experience as a reading recovery teacher, reading interventionist, dyslexia specialist, and instructional coach. As a supervisor and an instructional lead for the adult education program at Region 1 Education Service Center, CAT has launched academies for adult learners such as Family Literacy Academy, and developed an Administrative Leadership Excellent Academy project for ESL internationally trained professionals. She earned her bachelor's degree in bilingual bicultural studies with a minor in English and a second language, and a master's degree as an all-level reading specialist, master reading teacher from the formerly known University of Texas Pan America. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Kat in the chat pod. And I want to say that I was so excited for Kat to be here today because of her reading background. I have been a fan for a very long time, so I'm going to turn it over to Kat. I'm going to turn off my camera, and here we go.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to turn on my camera so I can see all of you and you can see me. I'm going to turn it off and start sharing the presentation. So again, thank you for being here. Okay, so let's begin. Before I begin, I do want to give a shout out to all the Region 1 adult education team. The instructors are here, my colleagues, supervisors are here, so thank you very much for joining. I also want to give thanks to Beth Ponder and Dr. Escamilla, and I also want to thank you, Anne Marie, for always singing my praises and just for your outstanding leadership. It's just such a breath of fresh air, so I really want to thank you. And I also want to thank all of you that are here today. You are by far the true superheroes, and today's session is going to be superhero themed, so fasten your capes, and here we go, okay? So just a review of the session objectives. Today, you will get an overview of effective instructional and engaging strategies for the AEL classroom, the use of reading and writing connections for high-yield instructional processes and products for all learners, and the use of targeted vocabulary instruction for student success. All of these strategies are success-oriented, and they come from the following resources. This is a list of resources that I will be referencing and referring throughout today's presentation. And all of these are based with elements of not only pedagogy, but andragogy. And Susan McShane tells us in her book, we know that there is no one single resource that can provide all the answers. So the great thing about this is that I've heard people say, well, I can always find a piece of research to back up any claim or argument. And although that may be true, what we are going to draw on today is the converging research. Those entities of researchers that have found their practices and they've come together and realized that out of everything they researched, they converge into this great stuff for us to use, these best practices, the success-oriented and high-yield strategies that are not only research-based and evidence-based. And so we get the best of both worlds. I'm also going to be referring to the parts book by Ted Arnold, and I don't know if you are familiar with it, and I hope that you are, and we will be looking at that a little later. And so as practitioners, we always want to make sure that we draw from the pool of converging research that tells us that these are the best practices that we want to employ. So let's start off with this slide, and just know that the content presented today is dense in nature, and so the pace may be brisk at times. So it's important for you to know that if there's anything that you really would like to try or want more information on, you can always jot it down and make sure that you do your own research of the converging research out there that is available to us. The great thing about what I have found in using these resources, whether they're andragogy or pedagogy based, there's common threads of best practices linking them together, and they work for all learners. And this is where we're going to start. They yield a greater return on our student investment. So the first one is, these are the strategies for effective instruction. So the first one is optimized engaged time and time on task. And what I want to point out on these first four, there's six, but the first four are written in the form of a ratio or an equation. So if you do this, this is going to happen, right? So the first one is, the equation is very simple. The more time the students are actively engaged in instructional activities, the more they learn. So the more time they invest, the more time that they learn. The same thing for promoting high levels of success. The more successful when a student is engaged in an academic task, the more that they achieve and then allow themselves to take more academic risks, whether employing a technique or using something that they've learned in the application stage of their learning. The next one is increased content coverage. The more academic content as instructors and practitioners that we cover effectively equals for greater potential for student learning. And number four, instructional and interactive groups. The more time in teacher facilitated, well-designed instructional groups equals a greater promotion of learning. And so those first four are the ones that are written as ratios, and it kind of makes sense once we put them in those terms. And this is from the work from Anita Archer and Charles Hughes. The fifth strategy is scaffolding up or down. And so the support, structure, and guidance is crucial in scaffolding instruction for students. You couple that with a gradual release of responsibility, and you end up with individual and independent learners. And so we know that the brain loves patterns, and consistency and continuity lend themselves to better rates of learning for our students. So all of the scaffolds are built around the Anita Archer framework of I do, we do, you do. And in the you do part, that's where that gradual release of responsibility takes place. And even then, that gradual release of responsibility is done via a scaffold, right? So if I'm in the we do part of the lesson, it's instructor plus student. Then I move to the you do part of the lesson. So in the you do part of the lesson, I don't immediately release that responsibility so that the student is practicing a skill independently. There's a scaffold to that part. So what does that scaffold look like? So first is I release the responsibility of practicing that skill in a group, in a small, well-designed instructional group of maybe 3 or 4. The next scaffold in the you do is now you're going to practice that skill with a partner or a dyad, and you're going to practice that skill with each other. But now here's where I can add a layer of difficulty, because I've gone from a small group of 3 or 4 with a fairly simple application of the skill to then a group of 2 with a layer of difficulty added to that. Then the final scaffold in the you do part of this would be the independent practice. And again, in the independent practice, I don't immediately give a challenging application of the skill or technique. I want to make sure that I scaffold that as well. So scaffolding is that part of our practice as instructors to be able to figure out exactly where the scaffolding would take place. And last but not least is the different forms of knowledge. So when we talk about different forms of knowledge, we're talking about the basic three: declarative, procedural, or conditional levels of knowledge. The declarative level of knowledge is that factual information that we want our students to know. Basically, what something is, the facts about it. Procedural is how it's done. How is this technique or skill applied? And lastly, the conditional level. When and where am I supposed to use the skill or technique? So this is different from what we know as a different forms of knowledge or the modalities that students learn in. This is the different forms of knowledge that we address in our instructional delivery of content. And so we don't want to get those confused. Now, some points to consider with adult learners is one, they have a wealth of prior knowledge, and we can activate that prior knowledge and definitely draw from it and use it to our advantage when we're delivering the instruction. Secondly, they have a high level of ability to cognitively multitask, given that the content that they're multitasking with is scaffolded and accessible to the level that they need. So keep that in mind. And then of course, their motivation. What is their why? Why is it that they're there? And those are three areas that we always want to keep in mind and consider as we're tapping into their knowledge. Along with effective instructional strategies, not tragedies, guys. I'm sorry, I almost said tragedies. I mean strategies. Sorry about that. Is the effective instructional use of time, okay? And Archer and Hughes suggest these 8 formats. So the first one is the increase allocated of time. Time is spent in critical content areas, and so we want to make sure that it's spent there well and it's increased in those critical areas, which leads to number 2, matching the content and instructional needs of our students. So consider the skill, the level of difficulty, any prerequisite knowledge, the forms of knowledge, and that we just talked about when you scaffold and use those to scaffold your instruction. The next one is learning on time. You want to start on time, stick to the schedule, be prepared. The next one is instructional groups. Teaching in small, well-designed instructional groups as much as possible and whenever possible. And this is applicable not only in the virtual world that we're living in now, but also once we get to a more traditional way of teaching in real life as well. The next one is preparedness, which goes with learning on time. So this talks about teacher preparedness. So make sure that you stay on topic, avoid digression, use appropriate anecdotes and analogy for teachable moments, but always keep that instructional purpose in mind and don't digress from that. And it'll definitely lead to those increased student learning outcomes that we talked about. The next one is transitional time. So instructional time can be lost in transitions. So keep those transitions organized and keep the time loss to a minimum. And of course, routines. So routines are taught for everything, especially instructional routines, regardless of the student's age. The brain likes consistency and it likes continuity, especially if it's learning a new content. So there's a kind of what I like to call cognitive comfort in knowing that I'm gonna learn something new that's going to stretch my learning, but I find comfort in knowing the routine. What am I gonna do first, next, and last? So that cognitive comfort lays the foundation for me to be able to take those risks when learning something new. So I'm going to stop right here and I'm going to set up my own instructional routine, okay? So every time you see this question mark, I want you to make a connection. Just like we use the 3 levels of making connections in our instruction, we want to use today every time you use this question to make a connection. So either you're going to make a connection from text to self, and text is the content, right? The content that we're talking about today. So text to self, or text to text, or text to world. And in this case, our adult educational world. So I'm going to ask you right now, do you have any questions? And Anne-Marie, I can't see the chat box, so if there's any questions, can you relay those to me at this time?
I will. There's a little delay sometimes, but no questions so far.
Well, thank you. And before we keep going, I'm going to do a chat box activity. So what I want you to do is make a connection. Text to self, text to text, text to our adult education world. Type one strategy from the ones that you just saw and we discussed that you want or can use ASAP with your students.
And Kat, why don't we go back to the slide you're referring to so they can think about it. There we go. Awesome.
So we can use this one to make a connection on those 3 levels of connections, or this one.
We've got several coming in, creating a routine, teachable moments, scaffoldings come in a few times, instructional interactive groups, goodness. And scaffolding is very popular, so, and routines.
Okay, good, good, routines, good. The one that I always tend to not forget, but it's not always at the forefront of my mind, is the different forms of knowledge. So thank you for sharing, everybody, and we're going to move on. And you'll have other opportunities throughout the presentation to make connections to the content that we are discussing today. So now what we're going to go into as superheroes, right? We want to make sure that we add to our tool belt of tools that we have to use with our students. And the ones that we're going to talk about right now, although there's a reading and writing connection, these are going to be the ones for reading. And I'm sure you're familiar with most of these. And so I'm going to give a quick explanation of them and then move on. So the first one is echo reading. And here's where an instructor reads. And the instructor reads to the students, emphasizing several things such as natural pauses, intonation, punctuation, phrasing, prosody, expression. And the instructor reads it in chunks that would be naturally occurring chunks of reading, as we fluent readers do. Then the student would repeat that. And this is especially beneficial for students that are coming into our classrooms, maybe from English as a second language classrooms. They still need that support and that scaffolding. The second one is repeated reading. Again, here is where the instructor models the text with, again, natural phrasing, intonation, and prosody, and then the student independently and quietly reads that text, and sometimes may have to reread that text or do repeated readings of the text. And this is especially beneficial when you are interacting with content that is more challenging, or it's specific content to maybe science or historical content. So you want to keep that in mind. You want to consider the content that you're using, the text that you're interacting with, and selecting the strategy that you're going to use for this. The next one would be choral reading. And so here's where instructors read the material out loud together with a student. And this is greatly beneficial because here's where you get to engage more students that would normally or would be afraid to read out loud together in front of the class. This is where everybody does a choral reading. And we'll talk about a choral response later. Then we have closed reading. This is similar to what you might know as a closed writing activity, but this is a closed oral reading activity. So for this, you read the text, you pause at key words, and when you pause, the students fill in that blank orally by saying the word out loud. Now you want to emphasize the pause, and you want to allow for students to read that particular word that you paused at, given that they know the word. And we'll talk about front loading some of those words. But the benefit to the student here is that it increases, 1, student attentiveness, and 2, for the instructor, you can get through and read material that maybe you want to read through a little faster than usual. So you would read, pause, let them fill in the blank orally, and then you continue reading. One hint here that I want to emphasize is that you want to pause on words or vocabulary terms that are going to increase the comprehension of the content you want them to understand and interact with. So not just words that they know, and that may be a scaffold if you are working with an English language learner maybe that needs that, but as you are working and interacting with more challenging text, you definitely want to emphasize those words. And so here is where you want to always consider that scaffolding. And the last one, of course, is partner reading, which is the best alternative to round robin reading. This is where you increase the practice of the reading and the content that they're using. The instructor facilitates the room and ensure that this reading is happening. And then the instructor can focus on maybe areas of need that the student has that otherwise would not have surfaced not doing this kind of reading. And there's an instructional routine for this. So you want to assign partner 1 and partner 2. And when I use this strategy, I always have those partnerships based on their level. So you don't want to frustrate students by partnering them with instructional needs that are too far apart. You always want to partner them with similar instructional needs. And then I give them the routine. So you have partner 1, partner 2. You're going to read the text on page 84. Partner 1 reads paragraphs 1 through 4. Partner 2 then reads paragraphs 5 through 8. And you switch. Then you have an after reading activity. So once you're done, you're going to respond to the reading in this format. And I give them the format. And that's the routine. The partner, the text, the after reading response. And they know that routine. So regardless of what they're going to read and encounter and find challenging, they find that cognitive comfort in doing that. So I do want to point out a note on popcorn reading that used to be popular back in the day. And so just like we talked about best practices, there's also practices that we want to avoid. And popcorn reading is one of those practices that we just don't want to use anymore because it places cognitive challenge that is unnecessarily needed. So if that's something that we're still practicing, you might want to look at this list and try something else. You also want to stay away from long sustained reading by students without any pausing for comprehension check, vocabulary check. You always want to use that chunking strategy regardless of what strategy you're using. And so now I want to tether back to those responses to reading, and we're still in the reading portion of the presentation. So here are the different types of responses: oral, written, action, or team. So oral response can be a partner response, and it can look like a think, pair, share, or a think and write, pair and write, and a share. A written response can be using through slates or cards. An action response can be something like pointing out, acting out, using gestures. And then team responses is something, for example, like numbered heads. The next strategy that it works really well and is a foundation for a lot of the instruction that I used with students was using mentor text. And so if the term is new to you, the National Writing Project defines mentor text as a piece of authentic literature that teachers and students return to and reread for many different instructional purposes. It can be studied, imitated, and it helps students take risks to be different readers and writers, better readers and writers than they are today. It helps them identify new strategies, formats, and techniques. And the thing to take away from here is that a mentor text can be a book, a poem, an article, a song lyrics, a manual, anything that was written authentically by a writer and used in the classroom. So the first thing is you want to front load it. You want to front load vocabulary and definitions, meaning of words that may interfere with comprehension. So you want to make sure in using mentor text that comprehension of the text is not going to hinder the specific technique that you're going to use with mentor text. You're then going to read it out loud and model the text. at that time, you're going to set a content related purpose. So for example, you're going to start with a purpose question related to the content. And what I like to do is I like to tether back and forth between the set it and the setting the purpose and reading it. So I tell them, students, the purpose of looking at this mentor text today is to see how this author uses, and then I state the skill or technique, commas in a series or figurative language. I read the text and then I go back to that purpose. So after I read the text, I say, students, did you get to notice how this writer uses series in a comma or figurative language? And I tether between those two because I want them to examine how a writer crafts a text, and comprehension is not an issue at that point. So the next thing I do is I'm going to guide them through that text. And remember, mentor text, depending on the skill, can be either a sentence, a paragraph, a passage. And so I'm going to number the lines, I'm going to or the paragraphs, and I'm going to quote and specifically point out the phrases of where to look in the book. And I'm going to give multiple examples. So beyond the lesson. So let's say that I worked on figurative language and I'm reading a different type of text. I always want to tether back to that original mentor text and say, hey, remember when we looked at how such and such author used figurative language? Well, take a look at this book by Ted Arnold. He also uses figurative language. Let me show you how he uses it in his book. And now I'm using authentic literature. I'm not having to make up sentences. The students aren't asked to make up sentences. I'm using real published writers to use their text as models for that technique. The next thing is tethering to the text and trying the technique. And so those two kind of go hand in hand because I want to refer to the mentor text regularly and use an anchor chart. So they are more prepared to imitate that technique from the mentor text in their own writing. So one of the things that I would do as an instructor is I had an anchor chart where I displayed the mentor text. And then I invited, encouraged students to say, hey, when you spot an author, writer using figurative language, commas in a series, the comma or, I am going to invite you to write that onto the anchor chart. So they would write it on a sentence strip, quote the book, the title page, and that encourages them to keep looking for those examples. In the book Parts by Ted Arnold, he does it really well. And what I really like about the book, and I won't get to read the entire book or go through it, but I do want to point out that this book, although it looks like it's a children's book, it uses figurative language coupled with great artwork. So it's definitely not a children's book when you look at it through the lens of using figurative language. And so what he does is uses common sayings such as, I bet that broke your heart, when the mom is talking to the little boy in the book. And then you can talk about what that use of figurative language is meant by the writer, but it's supported through illustrations that are literal. So you see the little boy with a literal broken heart. And so that is another way of scaffolding their understanding for that technique. So, that was dense. And I know that was a lot of content. And so what I want you to do now is make a connection.
Actually, Kat, what
There's
I'd like
questions?
to do is we've got several questions, and I want to just want to address overarching thought that has been put in the chat pod. Everybody, I know that everyone is teaching virtual classes right now, and our point of this virtual conference was to share instructional strategies overall. We're not necessarily going to be focusing on how to use these strategies in a virtual environment. And I know there's been numerous questions about that. And so our goal, Train PD's goal, was to provide 6 sessions on evidence-based instructional strategies that you can use in the face-to-face classroom when we get back there at some point. Yes, all of these strategies can be used in the virtual environment with a little bit of practice, whether it's using the pull-out rooms or, I'm sorry, the breakout rooms.
The breakout rooms.
Or, you could do partner reading. So there are ways to do that, but I felt I needed to address that. So, all right, so here are your questions, Kat, and I want to go way back. Can you please explain the difference between echo and repeated reading?
Oh, yes. So great question. So let me go back right over here. So echo reading is where the teacher reads a selected part of the text, emphasizing phrasing, intonation, punctuation, prosody, then stops. So this is where I can use chunking, and the students are invited to repeat that selection that I just read. So I would read something like, for example, I'm reading out of the Ted Arnold book, and I'll say, okay, students, I'm going to read the selection. Things are bad and getting worse. Each day is something new. With all the stuff I hear about, I don't know what to do. Your turn. And then the students read that exact same thing in an echo of what the instructor has read. The difference between that and choral reading is that we're reading it together. And so I know that there are few differences between that, but it depends on the purpose that you're using it to read. So choral reading would be better used when the student is already familiar with the text is not as challenging, and we're reading it together. We're reading it out loud, and the benefit of choral reading is that it engages more students, and usually students that would not be as likely to engage with the content.
Okay, thank you. And then let's go on to we're going to try to get to 4 of these. We addressed one about the Zoom teaching. Can choral reading work in Zoom? All of these strategies that Kat is sharing, yes, can, just a little practice and trial and error, right? Because we're all learning on how to do these Zoom classes.
And I'm sorry, Anne-Marie, I have actually gone into, as an instructional lead and coach, I do instructional rounds virtually, and I practiced with a GED classroom a little bit of the choral reading, and I've also done echo reading in an ESL classroom. So yes, it can definitely be done virtually.
Thank you for addressing that. And then the next question is, some of my students have a higher level of reading than others. How can I engage all my students per the closed reading strategy?
So the closed reading strategy, so you want to keep in mind that if you have a group of students that are at a higher level, that's where you have to combine strategies, right? So I'm going to have a well-designed instructional group of students that when I start the routine for closed reading, I'm going to select words that are more challenging to them. And I want to emphasize words that are going to be words that our vocabulary is going to increase by using that strategy. So here I have to do a coupling of strategies. Well-designed instructional group of higher level students at a reading level with a closed reading activity. And then I would even add a response to that. So you can layer and couple these strategies based on your students' needs. So thank you for that. That's an excellent question.
Okay, so I think that we're going to move on. There's going to be time at the end to go back to these questions. I promise I'm trying to catch most of them or many of them. And there was a question about popcorn reading, which I know you said is not something we want to use, but can you briefly touch on what popcorn is?
Oh, sorry. So popcorn was when I had a selection, and I don't want to describe it because then it kind of goes against best practices because I'm telling you the practice. But I'll tell you this, if you don't know what it is, I invite you to look up what popcorn reading is and the research on it, because I don't want to spend time on a practice that is not best practices, okay?
Exactly.
I hope that's okay.
All right, so in the end, I see that there are some questions about the echo and the repeated reading, and I'm going to let Kat come back to that toward the end.
So the next one, now, okay, so we talked about reading strategies, but we know that reading and writing are reciprocal processes. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now, and I'm going to look at strategies for writing, okay? So this strategy, this is a writing process and product strategy under the summarizing umbrella called Write Like a Reporter, excuse me. The general frame usually consists of providing 5 W's and 1 how. In other words, 5 questions of W's, which is the who, what, where, when, why, and the how. However, with adult learners, we can adapt to the content and the purpose when using this. So here, in this example, we're going to use a 2-column approach. 1 column is going to be for the questions, and 1 column is going to be for the answers. And what I really like about this, and this is coming from the Leadership and Learning Center, the 2nd edition, what I really like about this strategy is that it can be for a process, and it can be also used to springboard into a product. And I'll show you how. So the left-hand column is for questions that can be generated either by the instructor in the I do, by the instructor and the student in the we do, or by the student themselves in the you do. So the column on the left has those different applications when you're looking at it through the framework of effective instruction, and of course the answers and notes on the right-hand column. So let me give you some examples of what writing like a reporter questions look like. But before I do so, I do want to make a note about text features. And this is really important with dealing with text, or interacting with text of a student of any age, and especially an adult learner that has come back to our programs. So we want to always ask, are there any reader aids to help the reader understand the content in which they're about to interact? And so in my earlier years as a reading specialist, I created the term train your brain routine. And what that was is I trained my students to follow a routine to skim and scan the text that they are going to interact with prior to reading it. So what I asked them to notice is, are there any graphics? Are there any bolded words? Are there any italicized words? Are there anything in quotations? Are there any numbers? Are there dates? Are there any supportive features in the text that are going to help me understand as a reader, because the writer put them there on purpose? And so what I noticed is it would go through the text and ignore the stuff that was going to help support their understanding. So that is a routine that I taught prior to this. What is italicized? What are quotations? What are the numbers? I would do a skim and scan routine, and you can do that every time they encounter a text. And that's what fluent and good readers do. Avid readers do that just automatically, but sometimes that's not the case for our students, okay? So I wanted to talk about training their brain for a routine of text features. So here's some example questions that we can use in writing like a reporter for historical events. Who was involved? What happened? When did it happen? Why did it happen? What factors affected the outcome, and how was the problem solved? Or how did it affect people in that community and that state globally? The next one are samples for questions about concepts. Who was associated? What is it? Sorry about the typo. Where and when did it originate? Why is it important? How does this help us understand the world better? Again, you're already starting to see that springboard of text to text, text to self, and text to world connections. And then there's examples of questions to use with textbook reading. Who is mentioned in this part of the text? Who is most important? When and where did the event take place? Why is it information important to know? When did it take place? Why is it important? How is the information presented? Again, tethering back to those text features that help them understand these W questions and the how question. There are more examples of questions that can be used. This is just a sampling of the questions that can be used, but I'm sure as an instructor and your students, you can definitely generate the questions that match the text that you're using. So here I'm reading the text to learn. And then in my notes column, when I'm writing those answers, okay, I can use that information to summarize what I read. So I have my questions, my answers and notes are a guide to summarize what I read, to learn what I read. But then you can also use that as a springboard for them to write a summary. So then you can automatically see that reading and writing connection with one 2-column approach. And here is where that reciprocal nature of reading and writing is used to advance student learning. So you don't have to do a completely different activity. You have it back and you can refer back to it. And what's really great about this is that whatever I'm reading, let's say it's a historical article, I can also use that as a mentor text later on. So you're capitalizing on the time that you're spending by not doing different things that are maybe fragmented. You're always keeping the reading and writing process together.
Here's a question that we had. I thought it was an excellent one. Somebody asked, it says that, and can you go back to that strategy? Can we go back to that? Write like a reporter. It says that it was copyrighted down here. Does the leadership and learning setting allow people to use this in the classroom setting, whether it be virtual or face-to-face for instructional use? Do you know, Kat?
Great question. So I'm going to have to do my homework on it because I went to this seminar where I got a notebook with this strategy. Having said that, I also want to provide some clarification. If you want strategies like this 2-column strategy on writing like a reporter, or even not just writing like a reporter, just type summarizing. Summarizing is a metacognitive skill that all fluent readers use. If you just type summarizing, you're not just going to get a 2-column approach. You're going to get quite a bit of graphic charts and graphs and aids that can help you in teaching summarizing. This is just one example, but there are many examples out there that can be used. I have permission to use it. I have been trained to use it as a master reading teacher and reading specialist, but it's not the only thing that you can use. That's the beauty of being reading, writing, and vocabulary instructors, that we can use all of the resources that are out there. So I hope that provided clarification for that question.
Yes. Whenever you, and it's just good practice in general, whenever you use a strategy to, give acknowledgement of where it comes from. I'm looking for other questions. I'm not sure, Raphael, what your question means. Should we ignore the reading guidelines and use this strategy instead? I'm not sure if I understand that question.
Okay, I would need clarification on what reading guidelines we're referring to. I do want to say on his question, we never want to ignore reading guidelines based on convergent research that has best practices. So I'm picking up on the word ignoring, so I don't know how to elaborate on that. So now we've done reading and writing, and I'm going to go through a brisk overview of vocabulary instruction. And these are things we've already talked about. We want to front load words, always multiple exposure to words, interacting with mentor text, and using word learning strategies. And so I'm going to review one word learning strategy that is based on Marzano's 6-step process for learning vocabulary. So if you think about reading and writing as reciprocal processes, then vocabulary is the glue that's going to bind them together. And so that's why it's important to do these. So you always want to keep in mind that in Marzano's 6-step process, you don't want to skip steps. And as you use this routine with students, they will tend to move faster through it once they understand it. So the first one is the teacher provides a description, explanation, or example of the word. Then the student is invited to restate that vocabulary term in their own words. And it's made to be a student-friendly definition of the word that the instructor is defining, explaining, or giving an example. The third step is the student is going to have a representation of the word in a non-linguistic way. So what does that look like? They're going to construct a picture, a symbol representation. They can even act out the term, which is an action response. So here you're using that strategy we talked about earlier to create that cognitive Velcro that we want that word meaning to attach to, right? So that representation of the word can be coupled with the strategies that you saw earlier. The next one is a personal word journal. So you want them to make sure that they document that word and the meaning in their own journal. And this is a good time to, again, go back to using those mentor texts to give that support. You can use anchor charts or virtual anchor charts and personal word walls that the students, even if you're teaching virtually, they can keep at home in some kind of journal. The next step is the application and context. So always ask students to discuss the term with one another, which is, again, another response, a strategy we saw earlier, and use that word to play games, incorporate it into their writing, and use a response technique for that as well. So that's a brief overview of the 6 steps of Marsano's vocabulary instruction. So as we put that reading, writing, and vocabulary instruction together, we must not forget to always give students feedback in what they're doing, because they're going to be taking more and more risks because they're finding cognitive comfort in your instruction. So we want to give corrective feedback. Just a few reminders about corrective feedback. You want to make sure it's provided. It's immediate, specific, and informative. It's focused on what's correct, and it ends with student engaging with a correct response. So what I want, the analogy I want to make to you is when you're learning to drive a car, you don't wait till you get to your destination and park before your driving instructor tells you, put on your signal, look to your left and right, stop at the stoplight. You want to do it as the instruction is happening and as the student is making that error. You want to use a positive tone. You want to be specific. So specifically, you want to stop and be informative. When using this technique, the comma is placed in this location because, and you want to focus on the correct. So you told them, when using this, you don't say, oh, wait, that's wrong. Say, no, you say, when using this technique, this is where the comma is placed. And you're giving specific, informative, and you're focusing on the correct. And then you say, can you try it again? Using the technique that we're practicing. And so you're inviting the student to be engaged with a correct response without necessarily calling on the error, but rather giving the corrective feedback. When using reading and writing tools, always keep a finger on the pulse of the student's understanding by providing this feedback and using these guidelines, especially in writing activities, when using specific skills or techniques. Now, as superheroes, we want to unite and we want to keep certain things in mind. And so what are those things? That reading and writing are reciprocal processes. Think of vocabulary, mentor text, making connections on different levels as the glue that keeps that learning together. And if you keep that instruction focused and targeted, before you know it, your students are going to be their own superheroes too. And then you can partner them and have them be the leaders and the mentors of the classrooms that you're leading. Yes.
Kat, can you back up, since we're at 10 o'clock, can you back up to the effective vocabulary strategies, please? This is where I want to jump in, and I'm going to put the link to the Susan McShane book up again, everybody, because that book is going to give you wonderful vocabulary strategies that Kat is talking about, and it is a free resource that you can get as a PDF online and use in your classroom. And so a lot of great vocabulary, all of these are in the book. So hold on, you can download it as a PDF and have it for your classroom. So there it is. I put it in there again. Thanks, Kat.
And thank you for reminding me. Yes, I was keeping an eye on time, so I felt that I had to rush a little bit, but I do want to go back to this because you reminded me. In the McShane book, it's for adult learning, and it's the first steps. And that's where she says, this isn't a sole source for information, but it's definitely a springboard. And in this book, you'll find in the table of contents, not just vocabulary. You're going to find fluency. So the 5 areas of reading, right? Vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, phonics, phonemic awareness, as it relates to an adult learner. And in the section for vocabulary in her book, Applying Research and Reading Instruction for Adults, she specifically outlines these strategies. So what I love about this is that as I cross-referenced the andragogy that she presents in her book to the Archer and Hughes book, which is pedagogical in nature, there's so many commonalities that are mirrored. So regardless of the age of the student, these are the best practices. You want to use these practices with the students that you're working with because they are mirrored despite the age, and it also helps learners in their different stages of learning. So that book is really great. You're going to have a digital link to it. You definitely want to save it, and as you continue to work with the students and you find that there are areas where you want to maybe find different ways of doing it, you can definitely look to her book because she has actual examples of what parts of a lesson look like for those the 5 different components of reading. So thank you, Anne-Marie, for doing that for us and reminding me of that.
You're very welcome.
I really appreciate it.
And Eve says thank you. So,
Okay.
okay. So, right while we're here, Carolyn says, great question. Front loading words is the same as pre-teaching vocabulary?
Yes. So pre-teach, and it depends on the routine that you're going to establish. So pre-teaching vocabulary, front-loading vocabulary are similar terms. I wouldn't call them synonymous terms because it depends. So when the routine that I use in front-loading or pre-teaching words depends on the level of the student need that I'm working with. So for example, if I have a group of students that are really struggling with vocabulary or comprehension, then I'm going to pre-teach the words at a deeper level. I'm going to give the word, I'm going to give multiple exposures to the word as I'm front loading, and I'm definitely going to give that definition and let them interact with the meaning of the word before I'm even using it in context. So that's what that looks like for an instructional group that has vocabulary and maybe comprehension at the top of the list of their focus that I'm working on. Now, let's say that I have a different instructional group, and remember, we go back and I want to tether this back to those well-designed instructional groups, because I may have a group that is not struggling with the comprehension and the use of more challenging vocabulary word. So in this case, front loading the word may not go as deep as I did with my pre-teaching group, where I had to go into a deeper level of understanding with words. In their case, I may be already at the point of having gradually released the responsibility of the learning of vocabulary. So I would be front loading words, for example, by giving them the word and an explanation, definition, or meaning, and then letting them interact with the word, maybe applying the word, using it in context, tethering it back to mentor text. That is not a skill or application of vocabulary that I would do with my group that is still focusing in on comprehension and vocabulary. So the front loading words and the pre-teaching of the word, again, is tethered to the well-designed instructional group, the level of student need, the focus of their instruction, and the depth at which I want them to interact with the text. And then again, I'm going to be careful of the text that I pick for them to do that with. So you're starting to see how, as a practitioner, you're not only having to layer those instructional strategies, but at the forefront is the need and level of need of the student that I have grouped for that instruction. So I hope that's a long answer to what a seemingly simple question about vocabulary, and it's a very important question.
So I want to pose this question. Do we want to review the difference between echo reading and repeated reading again? Because we said that we would. Would people like to review that again? Why don't we just quickly review it?
So we're going to start with echo reading. So here are the parts of echo reading. The instructor selects a text or a chunk of text that they're going to read. Next, the instructor reads that selected text, emphasizing natural pauses in the text, intonation for punctuation, phrasing, and prosody. And prosody is reading with expression. After the instructor reads, the student is invited to repeat that chunk of text that the instructor just modeled. So if you're thinking about the Hughes and Archer framework for teaching of I do, we do, the I do would be the instructor reading the chunk of text, and the we do would be inviting the student to read that same selection of text after the instructor. It's an echo of what the instructor is doing. The routine here would be to coach students and let them know that they're going to echo the reading exactly the way that you read it the first time. So if I pause, you pause. If I have an inflection of my voice at the end of a sentence for a question, then you're going to have an inflection of voice at the end of that sentence too. I'm going to read it with expression, and I'm going to stop for punctuation such as commas or periods, exclamation points, or question marks. That's echo reading. The student echoes exactly what the instructor is reading. Then we wanted to compare that to choral reading. So for choral reading, the instructor and the student read together a pre-selected chunk of text out loud. They're reading it together. So the routine
Actually,
here,
Kat, repeated reading, the difference between
I'm
echo and
sorry.
repeated. That's okay. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Okay, so repeated reading. So this one is where the instructor, again, it always starts by selecting a chunk of text that the teacher is going to read. In repeated reading, the instructor initially models the fluent reading of the text, similar to what you would do in echo reading. You're going to read with emphasizing natural pauses, intonation, phrasing, and prosody. And you're going to read that text to the students. The difference here is that in the we do, the student is going to read that selection of the text quietly. That means there's no echo. The reading from the student's point of view is done quietly and independently. And sometimes it has to be repeated. So for example, think about the natural process a good reader does in reading a challenging text. When I'm reading a manual to, let's say, code my remote control, I have to read that thing 1,000 times before I get it. That's what the purpose of repeated reading is, to read challenging text that I may have to repeatedly read, but the teacher has already modeled what that should sound like. And this is especially beneficial when interacting with challenging or complex text. So in echo reading, there's an echo. In repeated reading, the instructor reads, but the reading is repeatedly done independently and in the mind of the student when interacting with challenging text. Okay, so I wanted just to review the session objectives and provide the downloadable resource, which we already did, and just think about these questions. What are those effective instructional strategies that you're using? How are you using the reading and writing connection to have that high yield instructional process and product for your learners? And how are you using targeted vocabulary as an instructional support for student success? And McShane said it best when she said, as teachers and programs become more capable of applying research-based principles for reading instruction, The real winners should be our adult learners and their families. We are the privileged ones to play a part in this important effort. So I wanted to end with that quote because it really speaks to the heart of the passion of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so, Anne Marie, I hand it back to you if there was any more questions that we could briefly answer.
Yep, let's go ahead and there was a question. Can you please explain partner reading again? And it
Yes.
says, could you explain partner reading, please? Would the partnerships read the selected reading twice or even 3 times, or otherwise, could the student concentrate on their assigned paragraphs? I guess afterwards? Okay.
Okay, so great question, because now what you're asking about is the scaffold part. So the quick answer to your question is definitely yes to all of those things. What I would suggest you do though is you always establish a routine. And what I would do is I would always make sure that they knew who partner 1 and partner 2 was. So sometimes, yes, I would have them read the same selection. Partner 1 reads the same selection to partner 2, or partner 2, and then partner 2 reads the same selection to partner 1. That could be used. I could also employ the different types of reading. So if you have a really fluent reader that can go through the text a little faster, they could do echo reading with each other. They could do repeated readings of the selected text, which is what you're asking about. So sky's the limit when you're talking about partner reading, because you establish the routine to allow for that cognitive comfort, and then you decide the scaffolding and how they read it, what they read, the selection they read, and how many times they read it. So excellent question. Again, coupling and layering the strategies.
Well, thank you so much, Kat. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and to Catalina for starting off this conference. An amazing job, Kat. Thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise.
Thank you so much.
Please take advantage of the free resource from Susan McShane. You will not regret it. I promise you, it is a wonderful resource. On behalf of Train PD, I also want to thank Olga and Beth Ponder for being such awesome backup support. Kat, I am bowing. You are a superstar, and I just respect you so much. So thank you. All right, everybody. We're going to say goodbye and take care.